Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Almassian. Today, I'm joined by journalist Ali Abunimah. He's a Palestinian-American journalist and co-founder of Electronic Intifada. And recently, we heard lots of allegations and reports coming from Iraq. Actually, the Cradle published at first a bombshell report revealing the kidnapping of a prominent Israeli commentator and a researcher, Elizabeth Tsurkov, in Iraq. The report forced the Israeli government to acknowledge the incident, which allegedly happened on the 26th of March 2023, so 3, 4, 5 months ago. A few days ago, Mr. Ali, you co authored a long investigation on Surkov, which included actually distressing information on the Israeli citizen. Can you please walk us through the timeline of Tsurkov's life and career path? Where was she born? When did she move to Israel? Her military and professional background, if it's possible.
Yes, hi Kavok. Thanks for having me on to talk about the article that I co-authored for the Electronic Intifada with my colleagues Tamara Nassar and Asa Winstanley of this very mysterious and interesting case of Elizabeth Tsurkov. What we know fairly well about her, and by the way, this was really the theme of our article, why we called it What We Know About Elizabeth Tsurkov, because we really wanted to focus on, with so much speculation and so much mystery, we wanted to focus on what is quite solidly known, and
Mhm.
that was our starting point. So she was born in 1986 in Leningrad, as it was in the Soviet Union, to Jewish parents who appear to have been active in the Zionist movement within the Soviet Union. They were
Mhm.
working with Anatoly Sharansky, who in 1986 left the Soviet Union to Israel, where he changed his name. A little fact that is not well known, recall it from the time, is that when Sharansky first moved to Israel, he changed his name to Natan Sharon.
Hmm.
And Sharon, of course, Ariel Sharon was the best known person called Sharon.
Yeah.
And this was in the mid 80s, soon after the Sabra and Shatila massacres. So the reason I emphasize this point is it shows the political leanings of Sharansky, that he was willing to call himself Sharon, at least for a short time, before he changed his name to Natan Sharansky. That's a little bit of a digression. But we know that Elizabeth Tsurkov's family was close to Sharansky and remains close to Sharansky. Sharansky himself has spoken out since her disappearance in Iraq. And today, as we're speaking, the New York Times has uh, an op-ed from Sharansky's daughter, Rachel
Yes.
Sharansky, appealing on behalf of Elizabeth Tsurkov. So that was their background. They moved from, they were imprisoned by Soviet authorities at some point, the parents. Then they left the Soviet Union and moved to a far right wing West Bank settlement in the early 1990s when Elizabeth Tsurkov was just maybe 4 or 5 years old.
So we are talking about Palestinian territories. This is a settlement on a Palestinian territory.
In the occupied West Bank, a very far right wing settlement. And this is the environment Elizabeth Tsurkov was raised in. As she herself has acknowledged, it was very extreme. To give some examples, when the Oslo Accords were signed in 1993 between the PLO and the Israeli government, these settlers considered that a form of treason. When Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli prime minister and former army chief of staff, who signed the accords, was assassinated in 1995, Elizabeth Tsurkov, again, she's still a young girl,
Yeah.
participated in celebrations. They said that they were actually dancing in the school when Yitzhak Rabin was uh, assassinated because he was seen as such a traitor to the Zionist cause. In
Hmm.
any case, this is the environment she grew up in. She went into the army, and we know that she was in the army. She served during the 2006 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, which was just a horrifying massacre of civilians and the targeting of Lebanon's civilian infrastructure, the so-called Dahya doctrine of deliberately targeting civilians. And more than 1,100 people, the vast majority Lebanese and Palestinian civilians, were killed. And incidentally, since they're in the news again, what is notable about that war is the extent to which Israel carpet bombed Lebanon with cluster bombs, these bombs that are just utterly devastating to civilians in particular. And I mention that because, of course, cluster bombs are back in the news in the context of the Biden administration sending them to its proxies in Ukraine. In any case, we know that she served in the 2006 Lebanon War. What she has revealed about that is that she spent the time during the war in an office in Tel Aviv. Those are her
Hmm.
words. What she was doing in the office in Tel Aviv, she hasn't revealed much detail about, but typically what happens in offices in Tel Aviv during a war is intelligence and planning and targeting and those kinds of activities. We don't know for sure. But she has also revealed that while she was in the army, she worked in military intelligence. So we
Yes.
know that at least when she was in the army, uh, in that period, she was involved in military intelligence. We know that after she came out of the army, uh, for at least 5 or 6 years, if not longer, she was a reservist in the military. In the meantime, as she claims, after her military service, she sort of had an awakening and she started to become interested in human rights and the fate of the Palestinians in the broader region. Recently, I watched a seminar. I hadn't actually watched this at the time we wrote the article. We read and listened to so much material, you can't cover everything. But in the past couple of days, I watched a video of a seminar of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. This is
Hmm.
one of these Washington think tanks from about 4 or 5 years ago, where she describes in that seminar that in around 2008, I believe it was, she started to get very active on social media and to become uh, to be in contact with people across the region, particularly in Arab countries, with people who she claims later became leaders during the so-called Arab Spring, the uprisings that happened across the region. So it was very interesting that she was in touch with people. Again, this is her claims that she says later became leaders. She must have some very sophisticated analytical abilities to be able, in a way, to predict
Hmm.
who would become the leaders of these uprisings or revolts. In any case, in the years since, let's say, the Arab Spring, so 2011, this period, and then with the beginning of the war in Syria, she became very active and involved with these various think tanks and uh, cliques that were very in favor of the proxy war in Syria that was designed uh, to bring down the government in Syria. So she was very closely tied into these networks. You could see on her social media the kinds of people she would talk to. She was involved with the New Lines Institute and New Lines magazine, which again is a very neocon think tank in Washington and is, as we describe it in our article, the intellectual home of many of the people who support many of the far right pro Israel neocons who were supporting the war in Syria, people like Michael Weiss, for example, among many others.
Michael Weiss was quicker than a fly in blocking anyone who would like to argue with him on any Twitter space or any social media platform. And I genuinely tried to debate such personalities for a very long time. And there is no interest at all, in my opinion, to listen to the other side of the story because there is a project. And I come from Syria, and I have probably 1,000 disagreement with the Syrian government, and I would like to see a major shift and reform in the internal system in Syria. However, at the same time, we know that when all these neocons and the Zionist lobby all unite hand in hand on one cause, we know that they're not doing this for the interests of the people in Syria. So we stick with the national government in the country against this tsunami of, let's say, regime change wars that happened in the past 12 years. But Tsurkov, she said that she had a moment and she claimed to have a change of heart, right? And became a human rights seeker, as you mentioned. Has she become an anti Zionist in the past few years? And does she recognize the Palestinian refugees' right to return to Palestine from their homes that they were expelled in the past decades?
No, in short, she absolutely doesn't. What she did do is begin to engage in quite strong criticism of Israel and its practices towards the Palestinians within, you could say, the confines of the international liberal human rights
Hmm.
discourse. And by the way, that's not always a bad thing. Those critiques can be useful. Even, for example, the description of Israel as an apartheid state exists within the framework of international law because apartheid is a crime in international law. But she, again, her criticisms never went beyond a certain level. So when I had challenged her, you talked about uh, wanting to debate or not wanting to debate. She would be willing up to a certain level. Uh, at a certain point, and this all happened in public on Twitter, I challenged her because she was saying, I'm not, I don't consider myself a Zionist, but she would reject calling herself an anti-Zionist.
Hmm.
And I would challenge her very specifically and say, does that mean that you have dropped your opposition to the right of return for Palestinian refugees? Remember, Israel doesn't allow Palestinian refugees to return to their homes in violation of international law solely on the racist grounds that they are not Jewish within Israel's definition, because Israel defines itself as a Jewish state. So a Palestinian born in Palestine is not allowed to return solely because they're not Jewish, whereas someone like Elizabeth Tsurkov or her family who come from St. Petersburg in Russia, or someone coming from Brooklyn or Cape Town or wherever else is entitled to settle in Palestinian homes on Palestinian land as long as Israel considers them Jewish. So I asked her if she had abandoned her support for this policy, and she would always evade the question. She would never just give a simple answer. Yes, of course, Palestinians have a right to return to their homes, just as Syrian refugees or Iraqi refugees or any other refugees should have a right to return to their country and to their homes in safety and security. Of course, Palestinians should too. She could never say that because she could not um, distance herself from this type of Zionist thinking. But nonetheless, you do find people who deploy her, who can pull up tweets where she's critical of Israel and say, "But look, she was supporting the
Hmm.
Palestinians." But of course, that again is a deflection from the sort of bigger picture of the kind of agenda she was serving, which was a in my view, a broader pro-American and pro-Israeli regional agenda, which is about removing regimes that the United States and Israel see as obstacles and installing regimes that they would see as compliant, or more frequently, just destroying regimes and
Hmm.
leaving complete chaos and failure and catastrophe in their wake, as we've seen in what happened with the invasion of Iraq, what happened in Libya, and what uh, was the plan for Syria as well, to destroy the regime and to allow groups like ISIS and
Jabhat
Al-Qaeda
al-Nusra and
linked
others
jihad,
Al-Qaeda groups.
all these groups, basically to flourish, because this would have been a catastrophe. I mean, war is always a catastrophe. I'm not saying that catastrophe was avoided in Syria. Catastrophe happened in Syria. The war that happened was a catastrophe. On top of that catastrophe would have been the catastrophe of having, I don't know who, Al-Jolani ruling in Damascus. This was the agenda that Elizabeth Tsurkov was effectively promoting and serving.
Mr. Ali, regardless of what we think about her work and everything, you say in your article that according to sources, Tsurkov is an Israeli, quote, intelligence asset, whether she knew it or not. What do you mean by that, first of all? And do you think such assertions put her life at a greater risk in Iraq? And I'm saying this because the um, the media backed by Azmi Bshara and the Qatari media, they called me several times spy for Assad as well, and it has endangered my life, and it put my life in a grave danger uh, here also in Germany, and I've been attacked multiple times because physically, of course, because of these reports. Are you worried with the with the wording of the article that could spark maybe an outrage in Iraq, and there could be some physical harm for her?
That's a claim that has been made by some of her supporters, and of course, I reject it completely on a number of grounds. First of all, our article is extremely careful, it's extremely well sourced. We don't make any claims we can't support. We do not say definitively that Elizabeth Tsurkov is a spy or is a Mossad agent or anything else. In fact, we even cast doubt on the claim that she's a Mossad agent because, frankly, she's too sloppy even for the Mossad. I mean, the Mossad has this kind of reputation of being this superhuman force who are so smart and so. The reality is that's a myth which is designed to make people more afraid of them. But even the Mossad would not be as sloppy as Elizabeth Tsurkov has been. We know for a fact, because she said it, that during her time in the army, she was in intelligence. We don't know what she has done since then. We don't know exactly what she was doing in Iraq, and we don't know on whose behalf she was doing it. It's very possible that she is a foolish individual who is simply behaving in a very foolhardy way and going on adventures that got her into trouble and in danger. But on the other hand, it's very mysterious that she was traveling all over the region. She was supposedly conducting research on behalf of a number of organizations. She's supposedly a graduate student at Princeton University. Graduate students are not known for having a huge amount of resources at their disposal in general. Of course, some may if they come from, very wealthy backgrounds, but there's no sense of who is funding all her trips. We know that she traveled according to her own claims, her first trips to Iraq, we have the dates in the article, but I think they begin around 2019 or 2020.
Yes, 19.
2019. And she was going to northern Iraq, she was going to northern Iraq, to the Kurdish region. Then she started going to Baghdad, as far as we know, based on the reporting that's out there, starting in March of 2022. She traveled to Dubai, and then she went back again in November of 22. She has also been traveling to Syria, to the areas of northeast Syria that are occupied by the United States, and to some of its Kurdish allied militias. And what's very curious is that when the news first broke, again about 2 weeks ago, that she had disappeared in Iraq back in March, this story was broken by The Cradle, a publication concerned with the region, but then it was confirmed by the office of Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister. And in the statement from the Israeli Prime Minister, it says very clearly that Elizabeth Tsurkov was in Iraq carrying out research in relation to her doctoral studies at Princeton University in the United States. That's in the statement of Benjamin Netanyahu. This claim has also been made by many of her friends and colleagues. But here's the thing that we found very strange. Princeton University has an absolute ban on any of its students conducting any field work in Iraq. An absolute prohibition on that. Princeton maintains a list of so-called Category X countries. These are countries that the university considers too dangerous for any of its students to travel to under any circumstances. They say that, they have different categories. Category A, where it's totally safe, up to Category C, and then they go to Category X. So a Category C country would be a country where they say it's very risky, but here are actions you can take to mitigate the risk to a point where it's acceptable. Category X countries are countries where Princeton says no mitigations are possible. The risks are too great that we impose an absolute prohibition on conducting any research there. So this policy was in place before, during, and after Elizabeth Tsurkov's travel to Iraq, supposedly to carry out research for her dissertation. So we know that she could not, in fact, have been carrying out research for her dissertation related to Princeton. So she could have been doing research for one of the other think tanks that that she was involved with. But I haven't seen anybody come out clearly and say, yes, actually, we funded her research to go to Iraq to look at these various issues. So it's something of a mystery that the other think tanks, I had somebody on Twitter from the New Lines Institute, where she was also a fellow, this neocon think tank, arguing with me, saying Princeton probably had some sort of exception where they approved her research. So how come New Lines isn't coming out and saying, actually, no, it wasn't Princeton, it was us. We funded the research. We sent her there. So everyone is denying responsibility for what she was doing there. Now, the other thing, you just showed, Kevork, a clip without the
from
sound
Iraq,
because I was talking. Do you want to play a little clip of that interview?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. And then we'll talk about it because it's very important.
And she's speaking in Arabic, right, in the video?
Fluent Arabic, which is also another mystery, but go ahead and play it.
Yeah, I will. And this is in Iraq,
in Baghdad, in Sadr City, as far as we know.
Sadr City, on a year ago.
I believe so, yeah.
Sorry. So.
السلام عليكم ست. وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله. بما أنك صحفية وصفي لنا صلاة الجمعة، شنو رأيك فيها؟
صلاة الجمعة يعني بمدينة الصدر معروفة جدا كحادث تاريخي له يعني جذور من التسعينات، فحبيت أحضر هاي صلاة الجمعة بالضبط بهذا الجامعة بسبب تاريخه.
يعني جئت مدينة الصدر؟
إيه.
الكوفة ما رايحة للكوفة؟
رحت للكوفة سابقا.
زمن سيد الشهيد
لا يعني
زمن سيد مقتدى الصدر.
ايه بالضبط، يعني أنا صغيرة بالعمر، يعني مو لهي الدرجة إنه قدرت أروح بأيام الكوفة. إيه ف هذا المكان، يعني هذا مدينة الصدر هي معروفة حتى من ناحية دولية كمكان اللي ولد ثورات وانتفاضات، وخاصة هذا الجامع
يعني رمز للشجاعة.
ايه للشجاعة ومقاومة ضد أي ظالم، يعني ظالم إذا هو يعني محلي أو دولي مثل أمريكا.
I mean that's maybe that's probably enough.
For the video is lagging a little bit, but,
but I
she
think
speaks fluent Arabic.
Yeah, Yeah, I mean that's that clip is probably enough for us to be able to make a number of observations, both about the fact that she's speaking Arabic so fluently and the substance, because she's speaking Arabic uh, with real ease and confidence, and
Yes.
even with an Iraqi accent, which is quite amazing, because people know that Arabic dialects vary very widely across the region, and the Iraqi accent is very specific in the Iraqi dialect, and she seems to be able to produce it, which I find very remarkable, because as late as 2014, 2013, 14, she's saying that she barely knows Arabic, and she's in 2011, she's saying, again, she tweets a lot, so we get a lot of information from her own tweet. She says she doesn't understand any Arabic, just a few
Yes.
words, and she knows the letters. Then in 2013, she said, I recently started learning Arabic, but it's so difficult. I'm really struggling. She
Yes.
keeps saying that. 2014, I'm really struggling. It's so difficult. But she never describes how she's learning Arabic, because it's so impressive for somebody who learns Arabic as an adult, who claims not to have known the language until they started learning as an adult, to learn it to this level and proficiency and comfort, to be speaking with people in the streets in Sadr city in Baghdad. But she never, as far as I've seen in any of her tweets, describes what kind of amazing Arabic learning program she was immersed in order to be able to master this. So that's an aside. It's not conclusive of anything, but it's very, very mysterious, because, again, as she even acknowledges in one tweet, typically Israelis who learn Arabic at this level, who are not themselves from an Arab background, because of course there are many Jews of Arab background, and there are also Israeli citizens who are, Druze or whatever it is, who end up working with the Israeli intelligence
Yes.
and so on, and even Palestinians too, unfortunately. So she says, she acknowledges at one point that, yeah, typically the profile of an Israeli who learns Arabic is spying. I mean,
Yeah,
she
this
was
is what she
saying,
says.
yeah, I mean, of course, it's just, as they used to say about Donald Trump, there's a tweet for everything. With Elizabeth Tsurkov, there's a tweet for everything. But so anyway, that's just struck us as very remarkable. Now, the substance of what she says in that interview, first of all, I mean, she's dressed like an Iraqi Muslim woman. And this is an IDF, a former IDF intelligence officer, and she's in Sadr city dressed as an Iraqi Muslim woman, is just quite remarkable.
Remarkable. Yeah.
And speaking with such ease. And then she is asked about Muqtada Sadr, who is
Yes.
an important Iraqi political leader in the Shia community, and she praises him. And she says, I wish all political leaders in Iraq were like him in terms of the stance he's taking. Now, this is ironic because, of course, in much of her work and in her commentary, she's very anti-Shia, and she often warns about, in keeping with the broader US-Israeli agenda of fomenting Sunni Shia sectarianism. She's very much part of that. So she scaremongers about Shia sectarian rule across the region. But here in this interview, she very deceptively portrays herself as an admirer of Muqtada Sadr.
Yes.
And also, she talks in that same interview about the United States as an oppressor against Iraq. She uses the word zalim
Yes.
about the United States, an oppressor. Again, which is very deceptive, because this is someone who was openly calling for US military intervention in the region. So this oppressor, you're calling on them to come and bomb and occupy countries and overthrow governments. So very deceptive, very, as one person I was speaking to put it, chameleon-like behavior that cannot but be viewed as raising very serious questions about what she was up to and who, if anyone, she was doing it for.
Yeah, she was for example, a no-fly zone for Syria, which definitely means, of course, the installment of American Patriot systems around Syria, in Jordan, in Israel, in Turkey, and probably from the Iraqi territories as well. She was for in 2021, even the Syrians didn't know what's going on in their own country. It took me 3 months to understand what was happening on the ground. But in 2023, after all the even the documents that were leaked from WikiLeaks, it's quite obvious that the movement was orchestrated. There was a project of regime change, not because of the sins that the Syrian regime committed, but for the sins that the Syrian regime didn't commit in the region, and that is the foreign policy approach. But in the past 12 years, Tsurkov was obsessed with Syria, and she was outspoken in her support of the radical Takfiri groups, and often whitewashing the radicalism and undemocratic nature. Besides that, she is also an arch supporter of the US-backed Kurdish separatists in the east. How do you explain her obsession with the regime change war in Syria and her vocal support for conflicting groups such as the Kurdish militias and the Takfiri groups? She supports both sides, and these both sides were even fighting each other at so many times in Syria.
Yeah. Now, I just want to be cautious because, as I mentioned in our article, we try to stick as closely as possible to what is known and what we can document. Now you're asking me a little bit to go outside that and perhaps to speculate a little bit, which we can do in an informed manner. But I just want to make that distinction clear, that we really try to focus on what we know. Now you're asking me, what are her motivations? And this is where I have to be much more, try to extrapolate or infer from what we know about her, and to give my very subjective opinion, which of course could be wrong. I think for me, the simplest explanation, the Occam's razor, the simplest explanation is most often the correct one. I think that despite her criticisms of Israel when it comes to how it treats Palestinians, I do think ultimately Elizabeth Tsurkov remained a Zionist, remained someone who wanted the best, strongest position for Israel. She wanted Israel to remain in a preeminent position. And she saw the fulfillment of the American agenda in the region, the American hegemonic agenda, as the best route to do that. So that fits all the different disparate pieces that you brought up well, because she would support groups like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and their Kurdish enemies, because that tends again towards an agenda of partitioning Syria, just as Iraq has effectively been partitioned along ethnic lines after the US invasion, of weakening Syria, of destroying Syria as a hinterland for the resistance, particularly in Lebanon, and of fracturing and splintering countries, which has been a well-known, tried and trusted tactic of the United States in the region. And it's particularly amazing that this, Israeli woman from a far right-wing settlement who was in Israeli military intelligence finds herself having these friendly chats on WhatsApp with members of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and al-Nusra, and I don't know which other groups, but those are the ones she talked about, to the point where she even talks about how she's having WhatsApp chats with them, how they're reaching out to her to talk about their problems and their trauma. And I mean, is she moonlighting as a therapist for these Takfiri fighters in Syria? It's very strange. Just as she claimed that she was in touch with, the people who would later become the leaders of the Arab Spring uprisings in various countries, she's also in close personal touch with leaderships of these groups in Syria. Which, if I were to go and meet with them or have a cup of coffee with them, I might be arrested by the US government and accused of supporting terrorism or something like that. but she was in casual contact with them, which again is, let's say, remarkable for somebody who just claims to be a simple activist interested in human rights and just, a modest graduate student interested in pursuing her own knowledge. The picture doesn't quite fit together.
Yes.
Yeah.
Actually, I will play a very short video of the ex-Mossad chief of Mossad. He was speaking about Al-Nusra Front, which Tsurkov was also communicating with them during the regime change war on Syria. I think it's very interesting to see this exchange and what Israel thinks and feels about the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. Just a second. This is the video. So this is the ex-Mossad speaking about on Al Jazeera on Israel helping Al-Nusra Front or the franchise of Al-Qaeda in southern Syria.
There have been reports that Israel has been treating wounded Syrian rebel fighters in its hospitals on the border, including fighters from Nusra Front, which is, of course, the Al-Qaeda proxy in Syria. Do those reports worry you that Israel's helping wounded Al-Qaeda-aligned fighters?
As I said before, in a different context, it's always useful also to deal with your enemies in a humane way. And I think that when you have people who are wounded and you can deal with them in a humane way, the considerations as to whether to take them in are not simply whether it's politically useful or whether it's politically
So it's purely humanitarian, you say. So there's no tactical or political strategic...
I didn't say there's no tactical. I said the main consideration, the immediate consideration is humane.
But the tactical issues involved, I mean, you know better than me the phrase blowback. You don't think there's going to be blowback against Israel if you get into bed with a group like Nusra Front?
No, I don't think so. I don't think there's going to be blowback.
Why?
Because I think that, unfortunately, the rules of the game in Syria are such that you can do anything that is not possible to be done anywhere else.
Yeah, I think people said that in Afghanistan too. Would you also...
He asks him,
fighters?
No, I would not.
So here he asks him about Hezbollah. Would you also treat Hezbollah fighters? And he says no. Why? Because he says the considerations with Hezbollah is completely different. The calculations are different with Hezbollah. Hezbollah has way acts of hostilities against Israel, unlike Al-Qaeda. This is what the Mossad chief says about them helping or treating Al-Qaeda terrorists. And this is, of course, the article from the foreign policy. And there are so many articles that document the Israeli support to the so-called Syrian rebels and giving them cash money and also treating them or giving them medical treatment in the Israeli...
But look who wrote the article. Look who wrote the article.
Elizabeth Tsurkov.
Yeah. So this article, which appeared in, I believe, in 2018, was the most, in a way, it wasn't the first, but it was up to that point the most comprehensive account of Israel arming and funding Syrian rebel groups. And it was written by none other than Elizabeth Tsurkov, who was in direct contact with these groups. So she is on... I can really only describe it as friendly terms with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and Jabhat al-Nusra, because when you read her tweets and her accounts, she's very positive, in general, very positive towards them. And then she shows up in Sadr city, disguised as an Iraqi woman, although she doesn't claim to be Muslim, but you saw how she was dressed.
Yes.
And she... falsely describes herself as a Russian researcher. She sometimes uses a different name. So her name is Elizabeth Tsurkov. Apparently she goes by Lisa to her friends. But in Iraq, she was introducing herself as Lisa Arkady, a Russian expert on the region. And she was asking questions about the Sadrist movement and asking various contacts in Iraq to help introduce her to leaders of the movement. Now,
Hmm.
if you are, so to go back to your question at the beginning of the show, Kevok, which I didn't properly answer in a way, are we putting her in danger with our article? And the answer is, of course, absolutely not. What put her in danger was her own activities, unfortunately, because when you are openly promoting and in contact with groups like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and Jabhat al-Nusra and so on, and then you're going to Iraq and you're asking with a deceptive false identity and asking people to introduce you to leaders of a movement that would be considered an enemy of those groups that you support, what are people in Iraq going to think? What are they going to think? And it is so disingenuous for people to say, oh, there's nothing to see here. She's just an innocent human rights researcher. She may well be just a very naive person. But it's very difficult to just say, well, that's all that's going on here. Exactly what's going on, I don't know the answer. I can't tell you definitively. But what I will say is that this has been a much bigger story in Iraq and in Arab media than in English language media, who have been minimizing it and trying to just treat it as a little distraction. In Arabic media, in Iraq, in Lebanon as well, because there are reports that she traveled to Lebanon, a country that has repeatedly been targeted and destroyed by Israel. Lebanon doesn't even allow, of course, Lebanon and Iraq do not allow Israeli citizens to travel to their territory, just as, by the way, Israel doesn't allow Iraqi citizens, Lebanese citizens to freely travel to its territory. Lebanon doesn't even allow a Canadian or an American who has an Israeli stamp in their passport to enter Lebanon. That's how careful Lebanon is to prevent the entry of citizens of a country that has repeatedly tried to destroy it. So the idea of an IDF intelligence veteran wandering around Lebanon with a false identity, when Israel considers Hezbollah in Lebanon to be its most serious and capable enemy, is not taken lightly in the region and is not considered just an insignificant little distraction or a humanitarian story. It raises a lot of questions about security in these countries, and that's how it's being discussed in these countries. And yet, in this side, let's say in the West or in the United States media, the focus is on her safety and that she's just this innocent researcher who should be freed, and as if there are no legitimate concerns raised by her activities. And this is something, again, that illustrates just the sharp difference in perception between people in the region and people looking at the region and trying to manipulate the region.
So I'm not claiming anything now. I'm not accusing her of anything. I just want to make a remark that I can see some patterns in the media. For example, when Russia attacked Ukraine, there is always this insistence that it's an unprovoked attack all the time. You can see that if there is a script, all the politicians and all the journalists are saying. In the case of Tsurkov, you can see clearly that all these big heads on Twitter and on social media platforms, they're all using the same terminologies, that she is a humanist and she's a human rights activist and she's a researcher. No mention at all, of course, all the context and the background that you mentioned. They are just taking her case out of context to present as if she's just a lone citizen walking around and wandering all of a sudden in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, having contacts with Al-Qaeda, basically, and other militias in Syria. But yeah, it's quite clear for me that there is something very fishy about her case, and I don't wish any harm to her. I will be very clear. If she is in Iraq and she's kidnapped right now, I hope there is a deal, prisoners exchange. And this would be my last question to you, because I want to know what the Iraqi government is doing in this regard, and is it true that Russia is mediating between Israel and Iran to free her in exchange for other prisoners?
The short answer to that is I don't know. If there have been contradictory reports about high-level efforts, negotiations between Iran and Israel mediated by Russia, I don't know if that's true. I don't have any inside information. What is clear is that this has somewhat embarrassed Iraq. There are reports that the Iraqi government is under some pressure from the United States. And again, which is interesting since Tsurkov isn't a US citizen. And usually
Well, the citizen of the United States, Gonzalo Lira, is rotting in the prisons in Ukraine, a journalist that the Zelensky government arrested, and the American government isn't even contacting the Ukrainian government to free him.
Right. So the context, it very much depends on what your political views are as to whether the US government is going to try to rescue you. But there are reports that the Iraqis are investigating Kataib Hezbollah, the group that is accused of capturing her, has issued a sort of a denial that they're involved. It's not exactly clear. I mean, at this point, we don't even really know who is holding her, to be honest. But of course, I don't wish her any harm. I don't wish any injustice to happen to her. I wish that there was as much concern for the thousands of Palestinian political prisoners held by Israel as there is for one Israeli citizen captured by Iraq. And of course, that's not to mention the many other political prisoners across the region and around the world. I do wonder, interestingly, because of her criticisms of Israel's policies, there's even something of a backlash against her in Israel, where she is being seen as somehow an enemy of Israel. Why should we rescue her when she was supporting haters of Israel? Of course, the ideal, I want to choose my words carefully, the ideal cover for somebody to gain credibility in the kinds of networks she was operating in was as a critic of Israel. So it's not surprising that with her other views, she would be willing to criticize Israel. But that's all to say that it's a very odd story. One final point, one final irony is that she was a big promoter of the Amina Arraf, so-called gay girl in Damascus hoax back in 2011. Amina Arraf was allegedly a Syrian-American blogger who had gone to Damascus and was involved in organizing protests against the government, and she was part of the grassroots movement. And one day we learned that she has been, abducted by the Syrian security police and disappeared. And Elizabeth Tsurkov was one of those who was very active in promoting Amina Arraf and in raising awareness after Amina was supposedly arrested. It turned out that, in fact, Amina Arraf was an American graduate student in Scotland called Tom McMaster, and the whole thing was fake. And it's this very strange echo that now Elizabeth Tsurkov herself has disappeared in Baghdad. She's really disappeared, but also there are layers of deception around her disappearance in terms of how she was falsely portraying herself in Iraq as Liza Arkady, a Russian researcher. So very strange story, and we're going to continue to follow it.
Guys, check what she says. Crying has now progressed to violently shivering. I don't even want to think what the Syrian regime has in store for Amina, this so-called gay girl from Damascus that Mr. Ali already mentioned, that it was a guy, not even living in Syria. And there were like hundreds of stories like this on the Syrian case.
Promoted. I mean, that's a story for another day, but actually in our story, we have our link because it was the electronic intifada that actually first revealed the name of Tom McMaster. We broke that story, but you know, the thing was given so much credit. It was so eye-opening for me at the time. Even doing this work all these years, Kavok, I still, up to that point, hadn't realized the extent to which the Western media is a conduit for propaganda. And the whole story of Amina Araf, the blogger, so-called blogger, was given credence, particularly by the Western media, by The Guardian, which ran an interview with her, allegedly.
Wow.
Their reporter never even met this person. All this stuff was done over email, so they had no way to verify who it was, but they presented it as a real person. So again, that was one of the eye-opening moments for me in terms of realizing how much we are being lied to by a propaganda machine, particularly when it comes to these stories related to our region. And now we have this case, this strange case of Elizabeth Tsurkov, and unfortunately, nobody wants to you know, I can't tell you how many so-called journalists were mad at me because we wrote this article investigating what we know and sticking to the facts about what we know.
I was reading the comments. I saw.
They don't want people to know. It's like, this is what journalists are supposed to do. They're supposed to gather and present facts, and they were angry at us for doing that. That's a very strange position for a journalist to have.
Yeah. And speaking of propaganda, I would just mention one last thing before we end up this conversation. There is a German journalist here. He was the Syria expert of a very famous German magazine. He received prizes for his astonishing and groundbreaking and very, very touching stories about the Syrian war. And of course, they're all against the Syrian regime. And he received prizes here in Germany. He was they celebrated him. He was on TV and everything. And 3 years later, his own magazine found out that I'm not speaking about 1 or 2 or 3, all the interviews that he claims he did with Syrians in his articles, all were made up by himself. He was asking questions and he was answering himself in these magazines. And here, this guy received prizes here, and then they withdrew all the prizes from him. They kicked him out of the magazine. But the narrative hasn't changed because the magazine continues the same approach, but with different journalists. There are so many journalists willing to fill the vacuum. Unfortunately, there are very few journalists like yourself, Mr. Ali. I told you before the interview in 2012, when I first started working in journalism, I used to read for you, and I do still up until this moment. I'm very, very happy, pleased, and honored to have you on my channel on Syriana Analysis. Share your insight on this very important topic, because we're not here to speak about persons or individuals, but about figures who have an influence and had an impact on certain political issues with grave impact on the mass population in Syria, in Palestine, in Lebanon, and in Iraq. There were harm caused by journalists, so-called journalists, against millions of people. There is, in my opinion, blood on the hands of many so-called journalists who, up until this moment, they push for these neocon narratives. They push for the Israeli stories in the region, regardless of what the people want in the region, and regardless what is best for the region, including now the sanction regime against the Syrian people. 15 to 16 million people are stuck in the country, dying slowly because of the sanctions. But day and night, they are working to find holes in the system in Syria in order to convince London and Washington to continue their brutal, draconian, and inhuman sanctions against the Syrian people. Mr. Ali Abunimah, thank you very much for being my guest.
Thank you.
And guys, I will put the link of Ali's Twitter in the description, and also the article, the investigation, which is quite long, but it's worth reading because there's so many sources and documentations that you have to go and check each source. Where is it from? And you can see that it's very solid and it's very well researched, and it's worth reading and sharing also with your friends. And thank you very much, guys, for tuning in. And if you want to support my independent work, you can become a patron. Link in the description below, and see you next time.